Fighting for our community is something the law firm of Bordas & Bordas takes very seriously. The Ohio Valley isn't just a place where we work. It's where we live. That's why you'll see us fighting the battle against breast cancer, coaching youth sports, providing meals for those in need, and supporting our local YMCA. Bordas & Bordas, fighting for justice.
Hi, I'm Jamie Bordas. Welcome to another issue of the Bordas & Bordas Legal Review. With me here this week are two of my law partners, Chris Regan and Jeff Brown, and they're going to be debating different sides of topics that I've told them in advance we would be talking about, and I've assigned them different viewpoints to discuss. The first topic we're going to be talking about this week is whether or not college athletes should be paid. Guys, thanks for being on the show.
Oh, great to be here, Jamie.
Thanks, Jamie.
Well, you know, this has been a hot topic recently, particularly in light of a lawsuit that's been filed by some former college athletes, led by former UCLA basketball player Ed O'Bannon. And as a result of that, the courts have been involved now and are looking at this issue. And let's first talk about why should they be paid, Jeff? Why should these college athletes who are already receiving scholarships, they're supposed to be going to school after all, they're there to get an education, why should they be paid?
Well, I think first of all, just let me say it's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to have a debate with Chris over there, who is the former national debate champion, and so I take it as quite a challenge and an honor to be here with both of you guys today. The argument, and I'm glad that these college athletes finally are on a level playing field with the universities that they deal with. I think that when you have 17 and 18-year-old kids who are undergoing a recruiting process, the field is not level between the two of them. The colleges have all the bargaining power, not the prospective student athletes. And I'm glad that in a court of law where many people finally see the playing field level, that they're going to have their opportunity to have their day in court. The issue with the O'Bannon against the NCAA lawsuit is that he became very frustrated, not by the fact that he wasn't being paid to play basketball while he was a student at UCLA, but rather the fact that all these years later, he sees his likeness, his number at UCLA and his likeness in video games that the NCAA and the company that makes the video games are still profiting from. And that struck him as unfair, and that would strike me as unfair as well. And I think that what we have to confront is the modern reality of college basketball and college football that are generating millions and millions, and sometimes with TV contracts, billions of dollars that are going to the universities when the players really could take advantage of that money to support their own families in the future. One of the ideas of the lawsuit is that while the students are at the universities playing their respective sports, that money determined, however it would be determined, goes into a trust fund for them, so that they can use it upon graduation. The vast majority of student athletes don't ultimately go on to make millions of dollars playing professional sports. Instead, they could use that money to support their families and whatever, or pay for graduate school, or whatever the case may be after the fact. And it strikes me as just simply fair to allow them the opportunity to do that.
You say these colleges are, you know, getting millions and millions of dollars as a result of what these students, these players are doing, right. But, you know, aren't these colleges taking that money and then putting it into academics and building buildings so other students can go to school and hiring professors and doing all those things with it?
I think in some instances there's probably a collateral benefit to the student body at large from having this go on. But, you know, I think that the wisdom of using those resources on top of somebody else's labor just strikes me as unfair. I think that it's ultimately the student athlete who is out there performing. It's the student athlete who's putting their body on the line. It's the student athlete who's taking time away from studying like other students might be able to. I happen to know that the amount of time required to devote to that athletic endeavor takes a substantial amount of time away. The fact of the matter remains is that the student athlete is devoting a lot of his or her time to these endeavors, and I think it's only fair that they share in the enormous economic riches that come from these athletic events.
Chris, what about the opposite view? I mean, why should these athletes not be paid? I mean, they are generating lots and lots of money. There's a lot of attention. After all, people are coming to the games to see them play. Why shouldn't they be paid?
Well, I mean, first let's address the Ed O'Bannon lawsuit and this issue with the video games. Because, I mean, legally speaking, those relationships are governed by legal contracts that were signed by folks who were, in most cases, adults. And if they weren't adults at the time they signed the contract, then different states have different laws regarding the applicability of that contract to them. But for those that are adults, the extent to which their rights to use their likeness was signed away at that time is governed by contract law. And I think it's a little strange. I disagree with Jeff that the young men, it's typically young men in those situations, had no bargaining power. I mean, we just saw National Signing Day in football yesterday, in which it seemed that the students, or the prospective students, had all the leverage in the world, with the entire sports world, every school calling them up, bidding essentially for their services. So they had a tremendous amount of leverage in terms of making those choices. And if they made a choice to sign away certain rights as an adult, then those contracts should be enforced.
Chris, okay, but on these contracts, I mean, you're talking about they signed their rights away. I mean, forever, for eternity, or just for those 4 years. I mean, this Ed O'Bannon lawsuit involves a video game that is now out years after Ed O'Bannon played at UCLA back in the mid-'90s.
Lifetime contracts are not unusual. They can exist. And if they did exist in this case, then there's nothing wrong with enforcing those contracts. Now, if a court finds that that's unconscionable because there was so much value given away by someone who didn't understand what they were giving away, then that could be explored through the lawsuit. But in the basic sense of, do we have rights as adults to bargain with someone for something that we want? Because Ed O'Bannon wanted to play for UCLA, and UCLA did him a lot of good in allowing him to come there and develop his career into a national championship career, which he then parlayed into riches in the professional ranks. So it's not fair to say that he didn't get anything out of that deal. He got a great deal.
Well, Jeff, let's, before you came to work at our firm of Bordas & Bordas, some 10, 11 years ago, right, you were an antitrust lawyer.
Yes.
Before that. And, a lot of this involves antitrust. I mean, now these players, Chris is saying, look, they had a choice, and maybe they have the bargaining power. But do they really? I mean, what's their option? They kind of have to sign this if they're going to go play college football. And there's no other option. There's no other place to go play football.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm glad you asked that question, because I think that's where Chris is wrong about this voluntary agreement, this contract law. One of the principles of contract law is that an illegal contract can't be enforced. And what we have in this country are a set of laws called antitrust laws. And what they prohibit is a conspiracy, to put it another way, for competitors to rig a certain game. Any sort of commercial transaction that we enter into when we go fill our tanks at the gas station, we are entering into a contract with the gas station at Sheetz. I agree that I will pay you for this gas that I'm about to put into my car. If all the gas stations got together at a big meeting and said that the price of gas will be $6 a gallon, as long as nobody charges less than that, we'll all make more money here, that's illegal. You can't do that. It's a violation of the federal antitrust laws. And that's exactly Ed O'Bannon's point here, is that it would be one thing to enter into these negotiations with each school bargaining separately, but it's not as if a student athlete could go to the University of Alabama and say, I'll come play for you if you pay me. Here's what the University of Georgia has offered to pay me, and I want you to beat that. Because all the schools have gotten together and decided that none of these people will be paid. You don't have an opportunity to have them bid against each other in that way. So I think that that's the nature of the O'Bannon lawsuit, and exactly why it's unfair, because the schools together have ganged up on these student athletes.
Chris, I'm going to ask you a simple question. Why is he wrong?
Well, I think that he's right in some of the premises, but wrong in the conclusion, Jamie. I mean, the fact is, you're talking about the total commodification of these students. I mean, the schools are supposed to exist for the students, to provide them with an education, to develop them as human beings. And if we start paying the student athletes, then we have basically made them employees of the university, existing only for the benefit of the university. And that's the step we can't take. Now, there are other things wrong with college sports in terms of who profits and to what extent over what's going on. But educational, I mean, interscholastic athletic competition should be for the benefit of the students and not for the benefit of commercial interests that are outside that.
Well, let me ask you about this, though, Chris. I mean, all three of us went to Notre Dame. We saw a pretty, high-profile college football program there, and in sports in general. It's basically a full-time commitment for these guys that are playing sports. I mean, they don't have a lot of time to go do X, Y, or Z like a regular student would. I mean, they're in the weight room, they're in study hall, they're at practice, they're watching film pretty much all day long, most parts of the year, including even many parts of the summer. They don't have time to go get a job, so they have money to get pizza or take a date out or things like that. Shouldn't they get something as a result of the commitment that they're given to the university besides just their tuition, room, and board?
Well, I mean, you say tuition, room, and board very quickly there, Jamie, but I mean the value of that package at the University of Notre Dame is over $50,000 to $60,000 a year. And not only that, but those students who attend a university like Notre Dame tend to get their degrees. They get benefit from the tremendous exposure that football gives them. That gives them an entrance into the business world. A lot of people seek out those people who've shown that discipline and that ability to perform through college athletics. So in that sense, it can be a true internship, a true educational experience. But if you start paying players the same way the NFL does, then it is just a job. Then no one is getting an education. And then you have a huge problem of how you're going to ensure and protect those players down the road. I mean, what are you going to do when you're being paid to play football at the University of Alabama and you get hurt as a freshman, and now you're off the team, and now you have no education, and now you have no football career? And we can't allow that to happen to people. We have to reform the system so that the students are protected from being preyed upon by the commercial interests that are involved in football, not bring them even more into that commercial process by treating them as employees and paying them.
Jeff, what do you have to say about that? I mean, if we pay players to some extent, I mean, does then the university kind of own them more?
No, not at all. In fact, I think just the opposite is true. I think that if you reach a common sense way to allow the athletes to share in the economic rewards of this above board. Okay? The other thing that you are able to do is bring a lot of this into the daylight, where you talk about it openly instead of where it's often under the table and behind the scenes, which is way a lot of these schools unfortunately compete over student athletes these days. You would also help to mitigate that to some extent as well.
It'll be certainly interesting to see what happens as the Ed O'Bannon lawsuit goes forward. Just recently, a judge said that the lawsuit would not be dismissed, that he could proceed with his claims. So we'll keep an eye on that and see what develops and whether or not it leads to players being able to be paid for certain things that occur after they've graduated, whether it leads them being able to be paid while they're in school. So I thank you guys for debating that topic. We need to take a break, but when we come back, we'll continue with a little bit of a sports-related topic, and that's the safety of football and some of the issues that have come to light recently and how those issues are being looked at, and you guys will each take a side of that. So stay with us on the Bordas & Bordas Legal Review.
Fighting for our community is something the law firm of Bordas & Bordas takes very seriously. The Ohio Valley isn't just a place where we work. It's where we live. That's why you'll see us fighting the battle against breast cancer, coaching youth sports, providing meals for those in need, and supporting our local YMCA. Bordas & Bordas, fighting for justice.
Welcome back to the Bordas & Bordas Legal Review. I'm Jamie Bordas. We're here today with two of my law partners, Chris Regan and Jeff Brown, and they're each taking sides of issues that I've assigned to them in advance of today's show. We talked earlier about whether or not NCAA athletes should be paid for playing. We're now going to turn to another sports-related topic, and that is whether or not football is too dangerous and whether or not the government should be involved in those types of things. You know, recently, President Obama gave an interview before the Super Bowl talking about the safety of football. He even went so far as to comment as that he would be very hesitant to allow a child of his, if he had a son, to play football. Of course, he has two daughters, but it's really in the news right now. And Chris, you've been assigned the side of that football is too dangerous. And tell me why, and tell our viewers why football is too dangerous and why there should be some type of regulation of football by the government or others.
Well, I mean, very, very sadly, Jamie, for fans of football such as myself, and such as you and Jeff also, football is on the verge of tracking the pattern of some of the historical public health catastrophes that we've had in this country. We had one many, many decades ago with asbestos. We had one several decades ago with smoking. And football is beginning to follow the same pattern as the revealing of the concussion risks of football, particularly at the highest levels, comes out a little bit by a little bit by a little bit. And all of these events suffer the same pattern. First, people are laughing at the idea that this could be dangerous, whether it's asbestos or smoking. Then people are concerned about it, but still downplaying the risks. And then ultimately you find out that what's been going on is exceedingly, exceedingly dangerous. And I think that is beginning to show with the concussion trauma syndromes that football players are turning up with. Just a few short years after professional careers are ending, people are they're committing suicide, and they're coming to be diagnosed with this concussion trauma syndrome that is revealed in the autopsy that shows that accumulated brain damage from the violent hits that football features now leads people into a situation where they've essentially sacrificed their life to the game. And we're going to have to decide as a society whether we're willing to accept that, whether the enjoyment that I get from football, that you two guys get from football, is worth it if we find out that some of the players are going to truly destroy their minds and lose decades of their lives to this concussion trauma syndrome. And I don't think we're going to be able to accept it for very much longer.
You know, at our law firm, we've handled a number of cases through the years dealing with head injuries, some significant head injuries, whether they be injuries dealing with or as a result of a tractor-trailer hitting someone, as a result of a product exploding in their face, something like that. But those are all things that a person didn't choose to get into that situation. They didn't choose for the tractor-trailer to hit them. They didn't choose for the product to blow up in their face. People are choosing to play football. Jeff, why should it not be regulated to prevent these types of serious head injuries from occurring, and why should the government stay out of that?
Well, at the NFL level, I think the debate is very different. As you start to see, I mean, the statistics are out there that would let you understand this, that the difficulty that the NFL level athletes are facing right now is that they are bigger and stronger and faster than ever before. And so we get into these situations where the repeated trauma gets to be an issue. And if we want to have a conversation about how that industry at that level will work itself out, then that's a sort of a separate debate. But I think what we really have to watch here is to not give in to a bunch of fear and hysteria about certain instances that happen with NFL football players and reach some conclusions about how football is regulated and supervised at lower levels, where I think that on the balance, football, while it does contain its risks at all levels, I think it would be wrong to think, boy, there's been a few instances where NFL players have suffered consequences as a result of the kind of football that they played over the course of decades. Boy, we really should stop our own children from going anywhere near a football field. And I think that one of the consequences of something that Chris legitimately pointed out about some of these public health scares is they are real. But there's also an element of fear that can cause us to overreact and to see monsters where none exist, and to keep our kids from a very beneficial activity. I think so many good lessons can be learned at the youth level from playing and participating in football especially, that I think we have to be very, very careful about trying to overlearn something that's not really an issue further down the line. Obviously, the safety of the kids is the number one most important priority, but I'm convinced as a youth football coach myself that you can adequately balance the safety issues there with making sure that football is still available for kids to play.
But can't you do that same thing through playing baseball and through playing on the golf team or whatever other teams that people may play on? I mean, why not say, hey, we're going to take this sport that's so violent, we're going to do away with that?
Well, I'm not sure that it's fair to characterize it as so violent. I mean, football is, to some extent, a violent game. But if it's properly taught by coaches who know what they're doing and properly supervised by medical professionals, which I think is important, then I don't think the game is so violent, as you just said. And I think that football is a unique game. It occupies a unique part of American culture, and I think it teaches young men some lessons that carry them very well. There's a plaque. I did my undergraduate work at West Point, as you know, and there's a plaque that all the Army football players touch before they run out in the field. And it's a quote from General Marshall, who was the Chief of Staff of the Army during World War II. And what that quote says is, I need a man for a secret and dangerous mission. I need a West Point football player. And I think there's something about football and the lessons that it can teach that are very beneficial, and there are certain lessons that can't be learned necessarily on the golf course, can be learned when you're working together in something that's like football is.
Chris, one of the things that Jeff just did during this his last comments here was make a distinction between the NFL and lower levels of football, such as youth football, high school, et cetera. Do you see any distinction there, or should we be concerned about this at all levels?
Jamie, I couldn't disagree more. I mean, honestly, let's face it. I mean, college football is approaching asymptotically the kind of violence that we see in the NFL game. I mean, we all know that a college season used to be 9, 10 games. Then it was 11 games. Then it was 12 games. Alabama played 14 games a couple of years ago to win a national title. Now they're going to add playoff games. It's going to be a 15-game season. It's going to be a 16-game season. It is becoming like the NFL. The concentration of talent that is going right into the NFL at the top schools is creating a game that looks a lot like the NFL. And the speed and the power of the players is unbelievable. I mean, college linemen used to be 220 pounds. Now they're 330 pounds. And those collisions are happening all game long. I mean, football is a violent sport. It's based on collisions. And those collisions, it is coming to be learned, are just not something that the human body can tolerate in the way that we would like to for something that's supposed to be good for you. I mean, these are scholastic sports. I mean, these are for the benefit of the students, not so the students can give their body to the game, but so the game can give something to them. And if we learn, as we are now learning, that there's a significant risk of head trauma, then we're not going to be able to keep doing it. I mean, we don't have college boxing.
What about, at the high school and youth level, though? I mean, people have been playing football for decades and decades and decades, and at the high school and youth level. Why all of a sudden now are things so different? I mean, kids aren't that much bigger than they used to be. They're somewhat bigger, but not that much. Why all of a sudden do we need to do something now?
Well, I think it's because we're learning more about what's happening. I mean, that was the truth with other public health catastrophes, too. I mean, there was a time when people thought that smoking was something that would give you energy and that would be good for you, and that everybody smoked and that it wasn't a problem. But as the scientific evidence came in as to what it was doing to us, obviously views changed dramatically. The same thing happened with asbestos. It was a miracle product, something incredibly useful, something that everybody liked. It was cheap. It did a lot of good things for us. But then we find out it's hurting us. In fact, it's killing us. Look, how many high school students can we allow to have chronic head trauma, to have brain injuries going into the rest of their life because we enjoy football so much, because it's such a part of our culture? I mean, it is a deep part of our culture, but are we willing to sacrifice high school students and college students on the altar of this particular game, particularly when the safety improvements have, in many cases, made it worse, Jamie? I mean, the fact that we have these helmets that are of such tremendous hardness and that protect the player so well with the pads, that's changed the way the game is played. It's made it more violent because a player wearing that suit of armor and that helmet can hit harder and run faster with less fear. But it's the injuries that accumulate over time that are so devastating and are really threatening the game.
Jeff, I played football for a number of years, through high school. Sure. So did you.
Yes.
I feel like I'm okay today. I feel like I'm, don't have any head injuries, don't have any problems as a result of that. I know you feel the same way. Right. Why is Chris wrong about that? I mean, we've had a number of friends that have played through the years. Everybody seemed like they've turned out okay. We're all still friends today. Everybody's got their brains functioning normally.
Right.
So why is he wrong?
Well, he's wrong because that's just the type of generalized fear. Chris is very good at identifying a problem here. That there may be a problem at the highest levels with repeated head concussion, but not very much about what our solution to this should be. And I think that with safer, better emphasis on safety, to use that data to make the game safer rather than abandoning it altogether out of some fear that some people have suffered injuries. If we abandoned all the activities where it was possible to get hurt, possible for our children to get hurt, there'd be precious little for them to do. They would further retreat into the world of video games where everything's safe in your basement. But I think that would be a huge disservice to the youth of the country to try to insulate them from all of these fears, even with productive activities. I think that that's a gigantic mistake and would have its own consequences. I mean, believe me, that would have its own consequences as we retreat these kids even further into the basement.
Well, and you point out, you make a good point because, one of the ideas, of course, one of the biggest ideas of sports is supposed to be to get kids active, to keep them from having problems with obesity, which is maybe a much bigger problem than head injuries in sports, to keep kids from getting into trouble, and certainly juvenile delinquency is an issue as well. So there are a lot of things that the football can overcome. Of course, now there's also an argument that can be made that there are other sports they could do that could accomplish the same things. I think that what you've pointed out earlier is that football, there are a lot of things you can get from football in terms of teamwork, working together as one unit, really gutting it out, going through the trenches that lead you to a lot of things later in life. So it's an interesting debate, one that will continue to get a lot of attention in our country. When it reaches even the level of the president talking about it, it's going to continue to get attention. So, guys, we're just about out of time, but I want to thank you both for coming on the show here today to talk about these issues, and I'd like to thank all of our viewers for joining us here on the Bordas & Bordas Legal Review. We'll see you again next week for another issue.